November 25th, 1942, Djedeida, Tunisia, 14:30 hours. The first time Oberstleutnant Karl-Heinz von Alstedt saw the American quarter-ton 4x4 truck, he laughed. So did his staff. It sat in the North African sun like a farm toy that had gotten lost. Squat, open-topped, no doors, no roof, no armor, no visible weapon, a flat little hood, round headlights like a child's drawing of a car, a folding windshield that looked more picnic than war, 4 ballooned tires crusted with beige dust, olive drab paint already sand-scratched and sun-faded. White stencil on the hood, USA, followed by a long registration number. A children's cart, von Alstedt said, according to the regimental clerk who wrote everything down the way a good German clerk does. Good for fetching bread from the village, not for war. They smirked at it like men who had earned the right to smirk. These were veterans of the Afrika Korps, real soldiers of the desert. Men who had watched British armour burn on the approaches to Gazala. Men who had seen the famous 8-8mm guns turn enemy tanks into torn cans at 1,000 meters and more. Men who had watched Mark III and Mark IV panzers drive Commonwealth brigades back toward Egypt. Men who had been told, and had every reason to believe, that German machines were the finest machines on earth. And this was what the Americans thought belonged in a war? It had no armor plate, not a millimeter. A burst from an MG-42 would saw it open like a tin of sardines. It had no turret, no cannon, no coaxial machine gun. The seat cushions were thin. The steering column was bare metal. The radiator sat stupidly exposed behind a flimsy grille. The engine, when one of the German mechanics lifted the hood, looked like something you would use to pump water off a flooded farm road. 60 horsepower, someone muttered, contempt rising in his voice. 60. To a German officer in 1942, horsepower was car, prestige. A Tiger's Maybach Hart delivered hundreds. Even a proper staff car boasted numbers the driver could brag about in the mess tent. 60 sounded like a joke. 60 sounded like a field generator, not an engine for battle. One of the younger lieutenants, sharp creases, desert goggles pushed up on his cap, paced a slow circle around it with a notebook. He noted its lack of doors. He noted its bare metal floor. He tapped its paper-thin fenders and snorted. He looked back at von Alstedt and said, "With that dry frontline cruelty only soldiers earn, the Americans send us tractors. Tell the men not to waste ammunition shooting tractors." They laughed again. Because laughter, in late November of North Africa, in the heat and dust outside Djedeida, felt like proof that they still understood this war, and that these new Americans did not. They had reasons to feel that way. The American army was, in their eyes, unblooded. It had landed only weeks earlier under Operation Torch, that first great Anglo-American move into North Africa in early November of 1942. Its officers were too clean. Its formations were too rigid. Its equipment, so far, looked confused. Tall, clumsy M3 Lee tanks with a gun stuck awkwardly in the hull. Radios everywhere, as if talking a lot could substitute for experience. And now this ridiculous little open truck, which their intelligence officers said the Americans called a jeep, as if even the name could not bother to be serious. Then the driver climbed in. He was not German. He was an American corporal, dusty, bruised, lip split, eyes narrowed against the light. He had been captured that morning in a skirmish near an olive grove. Someone in the staff group, no one would claim credit afterward, had decided to make him show them how the machine worked before sending him to the cage. Part curiosity, part mockery. The corporal moved like a man who had done this 1,000 times. He did not salute. He did not smile. He just swung behind the wheel, jammed his boot on the clutch, and with his free hand yanked the small second lever on the transmission tunnel down into low range. The little engine coughed, growled, settled into a hard, angry hum. He gave it throttle. The jeep jumped. There was, just beyond the olive trees where they stood, a shallow wadi, a dry cut in the earth carved by winter rain and forgotten by summer. The banks were broken and steep, 2 ragged shelves of sun-baked dirt and scrub roots. That nothing ditch had already cost the Germans time that day. Their Opel Blitz transports had gone the long way around rather than risk dropping a wheel and getting stuck. Even the light half-tracks had avoided it. Getting hung in the wadi meant winching, burning precious fuel, dragging with tow chains. Time and fuel were blood in North Africa. The Americans, von Alstedt knew, had tried to pull back across that wadi under fire. A few of them had not made it. Their bodies still lay where they had fallen. The jeep had been taken near there, more or less intact, and now here it sat, a captured curiosity, something to be laughed at. The American corporal did not laugh. He turned the wheel, pointed the jeep straight at that torn bank, and drove. No scouting for the easy angle, no planks, no engineers with shovels. He just dropped the nose of the jeep over the lip and disappeared from German view. Von Alstedt swore later accounts agree on that part. Several of the staff officers ran forward to the edge of the wadi, boots grinding in the dry soil. For a second, all they could see was dust and spinning tires. Then the jeep climbed, not slid, climbed. All 4 wheels bit, through sand, bit again. The little machine bounced once, twice, its rear axle flexing so far that a German mechanic actually flinched, certain he was watching the suspension tear itself free. The nose lifted, the grille came level. The jeep walked, there is no better word, straight up, the far bank, and popped onto flat ground like a terrier leaping onto a table. 10 seconds. That was all it took. 10 seconds to cross terrain that had forced an entire German supply element to detour for the better part of an hour. No winch, no tow, no track, no armor. 60 ridiculous American horsepower, and it had simply gone. The laughter stopped so fast, the air felt different. "Bring that back here," von Alstedt called. The corporal swung the jeep around, dropped it back into the cut, and did it again. This time at a steeper point. This time with the jeep nearly vertical for a heartbeat, front tires clawing at nothing but loose dirt, rear tires shouldering forward, engine howling with that furious sewing machine sound. Again, it came up. Now, no one was laughing. What they were doing, instead, was recalculating. Fuel drums, ammunition crates, spare machine gun barrels that overheated and warped in desert firefights, water cans, medical packs, field phones, wire reels, platoon leaders, forward artillery observers with binoculars and maps, wounded men, all the living weight that keeps an army alive. Von Alstedt stood with his jaw tight, watching the jeep idle there on ground his own staff cars could not reach without work crews and sweat. He felt, in that moment, something he would not admit out loud. Fear? Not quite. Recognition. This is not a toy. He stepped closer. He asked, through a translator, "How many of these do you have?" The corporal spat pink into the dust and wiped his chin with the back of his hand. "Sir? These," von Alstedt said, stabbing a gloved finger at the hood. "How many?" The American squinted, then gave a lopsided grin, a grin that men would remember in interrogation notes months later. "Sir," he said, "we got more jeeps than we got lieutenants." Later, German officers would insist that was American boasting. Later, they would say it was prisoner bravado. Later, they would claim they never cared about a silly little quarter-ton truck. That is not what the record shows, because that afternoon, for the first time, the Afrika Korps understood what they were really looking at. Not a car, not a tractor, not even a weapon, in the way they had been trained to measure weapons. What they were looking at was American reach. And that, more than any tank duel in the desert, was the first small crack in German certainty. Chapter 2. The machine that shouldn't matter but did. If you were a German staff officer in late 1942, you measured power in steel and caliber. You respected weight. You respected thickness of armor plate. You respected optics ground like jeweler's glass. You respected engines that shook the ground when they turned over. A tank, to you, was not just a machine, it was a statement. By that standard, the American quarter-ton 4x4 truck did not register as anything worth noticing. It weighed barely over 1 ton, A Tiger weighed more than 50 tons. That alone made the Jeep, as the Americans called it, seem like a joke. A Tiger's main gun breech weighed almost as much as the whole Jeep. The Tiger could kill a British or American tank at ranges where those tanks could not even see who was shooting at them. That was real power. The Jeep, by comparison, had canvas. Canvas for a roof, if it even bothered to have the roof on. Canvas doors, sometimes. Thin seats, an exposed steering column, a windshield that folded flat like a picnic table. The hood could be opened by one man using one hand. No turret, no cannon, no armor. And then there was the engine. The German mechanic who first checked under that flat American hood in Tunisia almost laughed himself sick. An inline 4-cylinder gasoline engine, 60 horsepower when it was in a good mood. 60. The Afrika Korps had generators with more than that. A proper German staff car boasted more than that. A Tiger's Maybach engine produced several hundred horsepower, enough to drag 60 tons of tank through desert and crush stone walls, as if they were sand piles. 60 horsepower was an insult, until you watched what those 60 horses actually did. The secret was not brute force, the secret was leverage. The Jeep carried a real, honest, mechanically simple 4-wheel drive system. Power to all 4 wheels, on demand. Not sometimes, not only in theory. All 4 wheels could pull. On top of that, it carried a 2-speed transfer case. High range for roads, low range for when you stopped pretending roads mattered. Drop it into low, and that tiny 4-cylinder engine suddenly behaved like a much angrier creature. Torque multiplied at the wheels. The Jeep could crawl, and when it crawled it climbed, and when it climbed it embarrassed German pride. Ground clearance mattered too. The Jeep rode high enough off the dirt that rocks, roots, rubble, and broken masonry did not gut it. You did not have to stop and build ramps for it. You did not have to lay down planks or wait for engineers. You pointed it and you went. In a landscape of wadis, mule paths, shell craters, farm terraces, and blown culverts, that single fact had more value than another 20 millimeters of armor plate. Then there was the turning radius. A German half-track was a respectable machine, but it was long, heavy, and stubborn. You did not thread a half-track through a goat trail without thinking about it. You committed the whole column and prayed. The Jeep, by contrast, could pivot in space you would normally give to a stubborn mule. You could nose it into a cut, change your mind, back, twist, and snake through without tearing down half a stone wall. That meant scouts could probe, adjust, try again. That meant routes existed that nobody had mapped. Fuel was the part that frightened German logisticians most, though many of them did not realize it yet in 1942. A Tiger or even a Panzer IV ran on gasoline the way a drowning man gasped for air. Gallons vanished by the minute. Every kilometre forward was a debt to be paid in jerry, cans, tankers, and escorts. In the desert, where fuel convoys died under fighter-bomber attack, that debt nearly killed the Afrika Korps more than once. A tank force was only as dangerous as its weakest fuel truck. The Jeep sipped. If you drove it with a little mechanical sympathy, it could go 15, sometimes 20 miles on a single gallon. That meant you could push a patrol far forward on what a German panzer company would call leftovers. That meant a lieutenant with a map and a radio could go look at a crossroads, a wadi bend, a ridge, a possible British gun line, without begging the quartermaster for a fuel allocation and a written justification. That freedom of movement changes the rhythm of an army. The Germans had their own light-field car, the Volkswagen Kübelwagen, clever machine. Air-cooled, simple, reliable enough in desert heat that even Rommel praised it. But the Kübelwagen had 2 fatal problems. First, it drove only 2 wheels. Second, Germany could not build them in American numbers. That second point mattered more than pride wanted to admit. American industry, by late 1942, was already producing Jeeps in terrifying volume. Willys Overland and Ford were turning them out on standardized contracts, parts interchangeable, bolts matching thread for thread. Crate them, ship them, uncrate them, drive them. Replace what breaks using whatever you stripped off the last wreck. A 19-year-old farm kid with a wrench and bad language could keep 3 jeeps alive out of 2. No machine shop, no precision fitter. No factory-trained specialist, just a socket set, a hammer, and time. By the end of the war, the United States would build well over 600,000 of these quarter-ton 4x4 trucks. German officers captured later simply refused to believe that number. When American interrogators told them, they thought it was propaganda. It was not. There were days when American factories rolled more jeeps out of their doors than Germany could finish Panthers in a month, and every one of those jeeps could carry a radio. That was the part von Alstedt had not understood on that hot afternoon in Tunisia. He saw a toy. He saw a cart. He saw an insult to armor and German taste. He did not yet see that he had just watched the American answer to terrain. Because here is the quiet truth the jeep carried into the desert, into Sicily, into Italy, into Normandy, into the Ardennes, and even into jungle airstrips on specks of coral in the Pacific. Armor wins fields. Mobility wins wars. The tiger looked like power. The jeep was power. Sicily, in high summer, shimmered with dust and heat. The air itself seemed to vibrate above the baked stone terraces and brittle grass. Olive groves crept up the slopes, and narrow mule paths twisted through the rock. A land made for donkeys and shepherds, not for tanks. German and Italian commanders thought this would be their shield. No heavy vehicle could move here, they said. The mountains would hold. They were wrong. The Allies landed at Gela and Licata in early July, 1943. To the Germans, the pattern was familiar. Secure the beaches, unload tanks, move inland along the main roads. And roads, they knew, could be destroyed. A few well-placed demolitions, a few burned bridges, a few craters, and the Americans would crawl forward, cursing the terrain. German rearguards planned to fight and withdraw, confident that geography would do half their work. But something strange happened in the hills above the beaches. The Americans did not stop. The first reports of small open cars climbing goat trails reached the German 14th Panzer Corps by the second week. At first, they were dismissed as mistakes. Scouts must have been on motorcycles, or perhaps the British were using mules. Yet by mid-July, officers near Enna were reporting that enemy reconnaissance vehicles, unarmored, light, and unbelievably agile, were appearing behind their roadblocks. One officer wrote, "They come out of nowhere. They drive where horses struggle. It is not possible." It was possible. It was the jeep. Lieutenant Charles Dawson of the 1st Infantry Division described it best in his after-action report. "We stopped trying to find roads. We made them." His men stripped the jeeps bare no windshield, no canvas, no spare weight, and drove into the interior like mountain goats made of steel. They aired down the tires for grip, kept the engines in low gear, and crawled up paths that even Sicilian peasants used only on foot. When the wheels slipped, they dug with entrenching tools, laid rocks under the tires, and tried again. Nothing about it was elegant, but it worked. At a crossroads near Troina, the German defenders waited for a conventional assault. Their orders were to hold the narrow pass, let the enemy break themselves on machine gun fire, then retreat at dusk. Instead, before noon, they began taking artillery fire from behind them. An American observer had driven a jeep up an unmapped ridge, dragging a radio, and called the guns indirectly. German units meant to delay for 48 hours were overrun before sunset. The pattern repeated everywhere. Roads blocked, bridges blown, valleys mined, and yet the Americans arrived. Not in tanks or armored columns, but in 2s and 3s, jeeps bouncing, dust flying, radios crackling. They carried water, ammunition, medical supplies, and coordinates. Every hill they reached became a new artillery observation post. The terrain that was supposed to protect the Axis instead betrayed it. The Germans had no countermeasure. Their Kubelwagens could not follow. Their half-tracks needed graded paths. Even motorcycles bogged in loose rock and sand. But the little American trucks climbed on, gears screaming, men grinning through dust masks, steering wheels jerking in their hands. In one captured German report, a major complained, "The Americans do not need roads, they are ants everywhere at once." That image, of endless movement, haunted the Wehrmacht's mountain troops through the rest of the campaign. The enemy could appear on your flank, behind your line, on the next ridge, and always faster than your own reinforcements. It was not just speed, it was reach. Every jeep carried a radio, and every radio could summon artillery, air power, or reinforcements. A lieutenant in a jeep could command the firepower of an entire battery within minutes. The Germans had no comparable system. Their spotters relied on runners or field telephones, both useless in broken country. When communications failed, their guns went silent. The Americans never went silent. By August, the Axis withdrawal to Messina had begun. German and Italian convoys choked the narrow coastal roads, retreating toward the ferries that would carry them to mainland Italy. Behind them, the Allies advanced not just along the highways, but across ridges and gullies no army had ever crossed in vehicles before. German engineers, who had bet their lives on the terrain, looked down from their own hilltop defences and saw dust clouds rising where no road existed. One American after-action summary simply read, "The jeep turned mountains into plains." It was true. The quarter-ton truck that German officers once mocked as a toy had become the key to momentum. It could carry a wounded man down from a slope that a mule would refuse. It could haul radio batteries up to an observation point that would have taken infantry an entire day to climb. It could drag ammunition, tow a light gun, or ferry a general all without armor, without ceremony, and without stopping. By the time the last Axis transport slipped across the Strait of Messina in mid-August, the men of the Afrika Korps who had escaped Tunisia understood something new about their enemy. They had laughed in the desert when the first jeep crawled up a wadi bank. They had stopped laughing in Sicily, watching those same machines swarm over hills that should have held back an army. For the first time, German officers began to request captured jeeps for their own use. The war diary of the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division noted, "Enemy small car excellent in broken terrain, highly desirable for reconnaissance duties." They gave them German paint and German numbers, but the symbol remained American, light, quick, expendable, and everywhere. In those jagged Sicilian hills, the jeep became more than transport. It became a philosophy, a proof that agility could defeat armor, and simplicity could conquer sophistication. Every dust trail it left behind wrote the same quiet message in the air: "You can't hold what we can drive through." And from that point onward, wherever the war went, next up through Italy, across France, into Belgium, and beyond the jeep would lead. Our reign came to Italy like punishment. By November 1943, the mountains north of Naples dissolved into grey water and sucking clay. Convoys sank axle deep, half-tracks spun uselessly. The road from Caserta to Venafro became a trench of ruts and broken trucks. German artillery ruled every ridge, and the valleys between were a swamp of churned soil and shattered masonry. Tanks stalled. Horses drowned in mud. War ground to a crawl. Yet somehow, the American lines still moved. Observers in the German 10th Army began to note the same anomaly that had bewildered them in Sicily. The enemy advanced even when the ground said no. They crossed streams that engineers had marked impassable. They appeared on trails that local Italians swore had not seen a wagon in a century. Reconnaissance reports called them light open vehicles, seemingly unaffected by terrain. The word jeep began to appear in German field messages. At first, it was spelled every way imaginable: G-sheep, sheep, jep, a foreign word forced into German syllables. On the ground, the reality was simple. The jeep had become the nerve system of the Fifth Army. Every unit, from rifle platoons to corps headquarters, depended on it. It carried dispatches when radios failed. It hauled stretchers when ambulances could not reach the front. It brought ammunition where mules refused to go. Its canvas seats turned into surgery tables. Its hood became a map board, a dining table, a pulpit for chaplains reading last rites under rain. Photographs from the Signal Corps show columns of jeeps nose to tail in fog, headlights blacked out, carrying men wrapped in blankets, rifles upright between knees. In the background, Sherman tanks sit still immobile steel islands in a sea of mud, while the little open trucks weave past them, splashing, coughing, moving. Lieutenant Colonel William Darby, commander of the U.S. Rangers, called them our horses. His men modified theirs obsessively. Wire cutters on the bumper, twin machine guns mounted on a steel plate, extra jerry cans tied to the rear. A Ranger Jeep weighed twice its factory load and still climbed gradients that trucks could not approach. They drove them up mule paths at night with engines muffled, headlights covered by slits of cardboard, speed never above 10 miles an hour. Behind the German lines, those same engines carried out raids that would later become legend. One after-action report from the 91st Recon Squadron described a Jeep patrol crossing a flooded valley near Mignano. The lead driver, Sergeant Frank Olivas, stripped to his undershirt, wrapped the ignition in oilcloth, and tied a rope to the steering wheel. Wading chest-deep in freezing water, he guided the vehicle by hand across the current while the engine idled in first gear. 2 jeeps followed, carrying wire spools for telephone lines. When the current rose, they chained the vehicles together like pack mules. The Germans shelled the far bank, but the line was laid, and within an hour artillery fire from the opposite ridge silenced those guns. That was the feast. Pattern now mobility defeating fortification. The German Panther and Tiger tanks, masterpieces of armor, waited for good weather, firm ground, clear visibility. They were predators, built for open plains. Italy gave them mud, cliffs, and hairpin roads. A Panther's 88mm cannon meant nothing when the vehicle could not turn around a corner. American infantry slipped past them on goat trails, guided by jeeps carrying radios and rations. The contrast was not lost on the Germans. Captured reports from the 14th Panzer Corps admitted that enemy light transport maintains communication where ours fails. One general scribbled angrily in the margin, "They float on mud." It was not far from the truth. With their low weight, broad tires, and short wheelbase, jeeps could skate over ground that swallowed 10-ton trucks. Mechanics fitted chains on tires, drilled holes for drainage, coated spark plugs with grease to resist water. When they sank, soldiers hauled them out by hand, laughing, because the jeep was light enough for 6 men to lift. It was indestructible by simplicity. No delicate parts, no hydraulics, no armor to crumple. If something bent, they hit it back into shape. If something broke, they cannibalized another jeep. Field manuals joked that the only real way to destroy one was to lose it off a cliff, and even then, odds were it could be dragged up, patched, and driven again. To German observers, this was heresy. Machines were supposed to be precise, engineered to perfection, maintained by specialists. The Americans treated theirs like livestock, fed them, cursed them, kicked them, loved them, and still they ran. By Christmas 1943, when German units retreated beyond the Rapido River, they left behind wrecked half-tracks, burned trucks, and abandoned Panthers too heavy to recover. The Americans rolled in with columns of jeeps, fenders dented, engines coughing steam, tires patched with canvas strips. They parked in them beside the ruins of the town square, engines idling like breathing animals. One war correspondent wrote, "The front line begins wherever a jeep can go." He was right. The jeep was no longer a novelty. It was doctrine. It had proven that in modern war, movement mattered more than mass, reach more than roar. Every time it crested another ridge under artillery fire, every time it ferried another stretcher through a flood, it whispered the same truth that had begun in a Tunisian wadi. Strength was not only measured in tons of steel, it could be measured in what still moved when everything else was stuck. By the end of that winter, even German commanders stopped laughing. Dawn over Normandy came grey and cold. The sea behind the invasion beaches was littered with broken craft, and the roads inland were already choking with traffic. Tanks, trucks, half-tracks, tractors, ambulances, motorcycles, and in every gap between them, darting like minnows through Wales, the jeeps. From the first hour after the landings, the quarter-ton 4x4 became the pulse of Operation Overlord. It was the first Allied vehicle to move off the sand. Its narrow tires clawed through beach mud where heavier trucks sank. It hauled wounded men to the waterline for evacuation, ferried ammunition forward, and towed anti-tank guns up dunes that German engineers had sworn impassable. Every photograph of D-Day shows them windshields folded down, hoods splashed with sea foam, names painted in white chalk on the sides. Daisy May, Lucky 13, ragged but right. The Germans, watching from the hedgerows, were astonished. Their doctrine assumed that Allied logistics would choke on their own weight, destroy a few bridges, crater a few roads, and the invaders would slow. They expected traffic jams, delay, confusion, and indeed, the great armoured convoys bogged down. The roads of Normandy were never built for war. They were farm lanes, 2 ruts wide, lined with hedges as tall as men. For tanks and trucks, they were death traps. For jeeps, they were invitations. Each American infantry battalion had dozens of them. They became scouts, runners, artillery spotters, and supply haulers. A jeep could slip through a side path, across a field, over a ditch, through an orchard, and come out behind German lines before anyone knew it was there. They carried wire for telephone crews, cables for engineers, and stretchers for medics. They even carried priests. One chaplain at Omaha Beach fitted his jeep with a cross welded from bomb fragments and called it his rolling church. Mobility became morale. Soldiers learned that if a jeep could reach you, you were not forgotten. It meant mail, rations, cigarettes, or evacuation. It meant the chain of movement remained unbroken. German prisoners later recalled that the endless motion unnerved them. One officer said, "We saw more of those small cars than tanks. They were everywhere, all the time. When you killed one, 3 more appeared." To the Wehrmacht, built around the logic of heavy power, this was chaos incarnate, but to the Americans, it was order disguised as speed. The Jeep's design allowed it to live where tanks died. Its short wheelbase let it pivot inside the narrow bocage lanes. Its 4-wheel drive climbed muddy slopes and crossed shell craters. Its engine started even when soaked by rain. It could ford water up to the hubs, and it was expendable, a machine meant to be risked, not revered. One anecdote from the 8th Infantry Division illustrates the point. A bridge over the Viri River had been demolished by retreating Germans. Engineers said repairs would take 24 hours. An impatient lieutenant drove his jeep downstream, found a shallow crossing, and tested it. The water rose halfway up the doors, the current pushing hard. He made it. Within an hour, 30 jeeps followed, carrying radios, ammunition, and officers who refused to wait. They established contact with the next unit before the bridge was even half rebuilt. That was the American style. Improvised, reckless, effective. By mid-July, when Operation Cobra began, the jeep had become a symbol as much as a tool. War correspondents loved to photograph generals standing in them, wind whipping at their collars, maps spread across hoods. Eisenhower called it one of the tools that won the war. Patton demanded his drivers remove the windshield permanently. "Windshields are for people going the wrong way," he barked. British and Canadian units painted theirs in camouflage and fitted them with Vickers guns, turning them into roving machine gun nests. French partisans used captured ones to carry explosives into German garrisons. Even German officers, captured at Falaise, arrived in commandeered jeeps, their insignia painted over. Speed of movement turned into speed of collapse. The Germans had built their defense on fixed positions, guns calibrated to known roads, minefields across predictable approaches. The jeep ignored those predictions. It made new routes where none existed. American logistics officers calculated that one jeep could replace 10 pack mules or 3 motorcycles in rough country, and where a tank might need a bridge, a jeep needed only nerve. At St. Lo, General Bradley's staff recorded that supply jeeps delivered ammunition to forward artillery positions every 4 hours more often than any other vehicle could manage in the hedgerow maze. When the breakout finally came, and American armored divisions roared through Avranches into open country, the first vehicles to cross were not tanks but jeeps, scattering dust and shell casings in their wake. To German prisoners captured in the days that followed, the shock was total. One asked an American sergeant, "How many of these little cars do you have?" The sergeant grinned and said, "Enough." By August, the jeep's legend had crossed the Atlantic. Newspapers back home called it the soldier's best friend. Children played with toy versions. Factory workers in Toledo and Detroit pasted clippings to bulletin boards showing jeeps on beaches, in mud, on mountain passes. They had built it, and it was winning. What no one yet realized, not the generals, not the tank designers, not even the men driving them, was that this light, unarmored machine had rewritten the map of modern warfare. In a world obsessed with power, it proved that movement was the truest strength. And in the green labyrinth of Normandy, where German armor turned in circles and Allied columns rolled forward in waves, that truth was written in tire tracks, 4 narrow prints running over broken roads toward victory. The Ardennes was supposed to be impassable in winter. The forests were dense, the roads narrow, the valleys filled with snow and frozen mud. When the German army struck on December 16, 1944, they struck where logic said no army could move. The fog hid their armor, the ice held their tanks, and for a moment the Allied front cracked open like thin glass. Convoys jammed every road. The American columns retreating west met reinforcements heading east, and soon no one could move at all. Trucks slid sideways, half-tracks bogged to the hubs. The great war machine that had stormed across France suddenly froze in place, except for the jeeps. They moved where nothing else could. Through sleet and snow, the little 4x4s became lifelines. Drivers chained their tires, wrapped blankets around the radiators, and filled the gas tanks with whatever fuel they could find. They carried ammunition, stretchers, and orders through country that maps no longer described. In those dark weeks of December, when the outcome of the war hung in the fog, the jeep kept the front alive. Lieutenant James Boland of the 101st Airborne recalled, "We had no trucks, no half-tracks left, just jeeps. We ran them day and night, headlights off, following frozen tracks, by memory. They carried everything, bazookas, rations, even hope." At Bastogne, surrounded by German forces, the besieged paratroopers waited for relief. The only vehicles that could reach them in those first desperate days were jeeps. They crawled through snow-filled woods, over half-frozen streams, hauling medical supplies and wounded men. One medic convoy, led by Sergeant Harold Weller, made 12 trips through enemy fire. His jeep took 2 bullets through the radiator, 1 through the hood, yet it still ran. "We plugged the holes with chewing gum and kept driving," he said later. The German tank commanders could not understand it. They watched the Americans move between pockets of resistance over what they thought were impassable routes. Their own armored cars stayed trapped on the icy roads, while jeeps appeared out of nowhere on logging trails, through orchards, across frozen fields. To their disbelief, the enemy's smallest vehicle had become its most dangerous. A captured German field report dated December 20th read, "The American light car seems unaffected by terrain or weather. It penetrates behind our lines using paths that are unmarked. It is faster than motorcycles, quieter than half-tracks, and very difficult to detect." The jeep had turned winter into its ally. Its narrow tires bit through crusted snow to the hard ground beneath. Its 4-wheel drive clawed up frozen slopes. Where tanks bogged in slush, the little machine bounced forward, radiator steaming, engine coughing but alive. In one famous incident near the village of Foy, a jeep belonging to the 426th Medical Company drove through shell fire to retrieve wounded men from a collapsed farmhouse. The driver, Private Albert Keane, made the trip 6 times before his tires were shredded by shrapnel. He walked back, borrowed another jeep, and finished the job. When a German officer captured later was shown the photographs, he reportedly muttered, It is not a vehicle, it is a creature. By Christmas Eve, the skies cleared, Allied fighters returned, and the relief columns reached Bastogne. The first tanks into the town were followed, inevitably, by jeeps mud-caked, bullet-scarred, headlights taped, their drivers hollow-eyed but grinning. General Patton himself arrived in one on December 26, bouncing through ruts beside the lead Sherman. "Give me more of these damn things," he said. "They win wars." The statistics told the same story. During the Ardennes campaign, more than 30,000 jeeps operated across the front. Fewer than 500 were permanently lost. Mechanics salvaged most of the rest, pulled from ditches, thawed from snowbanks, patched with wire and tin. The German army, by contrast, lost hundreds of vehicles not to combat but to immobility, fuel frozen, engines seized, transmissions locked by cold. In January 1945, when the counteroffensive collapsed and the Wehrmacht retreated east, the American advance once again moved faster than maps could keep up. At the head of every column, kicking up frozen mud and exhaust steam, rolled the jeep. Later, when captured officers were interrogated, they all repeated the same sentiment: "We underestimated your machines." One colonel put it bluntly: "You built an army that could drive anywhere. We built one that needed roads. When the roads died, so did we." In that frozen forest, amid the wreckage of tanks and trucks, the little open car without armor or glory had proven the ultimate weapon not by firepower, but by endurance. It could be shot, drowned, frozen, or flipped, and still it moved. And when the Battle of the Bulge ended, the soldiers who had driven through hell in those machines gave them a new nickname, whispered with respect: "Faithful Mule." The jeep had carried the Allies through their darkest winter, and it had done what no tank or plane could do. It kept the war moving when the world itself had stopped. By March of 1945, Europe was collapsing in on itself. The Reich, that once spanned from the Atlantic to the Volga, now existed in fragments, shattered towns, broken bridges, convoys of refugees trudging west through ruin. The great mechanized armies of Germany were dying, not from lack of courage, but from immobility. The Wehrmacht had been built on the promise of movement, yet by the war's end, it was the Americans driving their humble quarter-ton trucks who owned the roads, the fields, and the future. The jeep led the way across the Rhine. On March 7th, when the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen was seized intact, the first American vehicles to cross were not tanks or half-tracks, but jeeps. Engineers checked the bridge for explosives, while reconnaissance units roared across the swaying structure, their tires rattling over the steel grates, drivers ducking from sniper fire. On the far side, a corporal from the 9th Armoured Division parked his mud-spattered jeep beneath the bridge tower and radioed back: "We're over. Send everyone." The photograph of that small machine perched in the smoke became an emblem of victory, lightness, conquering mass. The Germans had watched this pattern unfold for years, but the sight still stunned them. Wherever terrain or destruction should have stopped the Americans, the jeeps appeared. They forded rivers with engines wrapped in ponchos, crossed bomb craters on planks, climbed slopes meant for goats. A captured German major near Koblenz said in disbelief, "They don't even need roads, they bring their own." By now, the jeep was everywhere, doing everything. It towed artillery through vineyards, carried stretchers through rubble, ferried generals and prisoners in the same hour. It was the post office, the ambulance, the command post, and sometimes the hearse. Its simplicity had become its armor. What could not break could not be stopped. Mechanics could swap an engine in an hour, rebuild a party-to, transmission in the field, patch a leaking fuel tank with soap. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley's staff counted more than 70,000 jeeps operating across Europe by the time of the Rhine crossings. They served in every division, every corps, every airfield and depot. Entire convoys of them, rows of small open vehicles laden with supplies, moved faster than any tank column could dream. The German army, deprived of fuel, resorted to horse carts. The contrast was biblical, an industrial nation retreating by hoof, while the Allies advanced on 4 wheels of stamped steel and American will. One story from the 71st Infantry Division captured the spirit of that final drive. Outside Frankfurt, a jeep convoy reached a demolished bridge. Engineers estimated 12 hours to build a pontoon span. The column commander, unwilling to wait, ordered his drivers to fan out and search for crossings. Within 40 minutes, a sergeant returned, reporting a shallow ford half a mile upstream. The jeeps went first, bumping through the current, water spraying over the hoods. Then came the trucks, guided by rope lines the jeep crews had stretched across. The entire division crossed before midnight. The Germans defending the opposite bank surrendered at dawn, surprised that an army had arrived from a direction they believed physically impossible. The deeper the Americans pushed, the clearer the truth became. The jeep was not merely a vehicle. It was the embodiment of a doctrine: speed over spectacle, function over form, flexibility over fear. It carried radios into forests where wires could not reach. It carried maps where roads had no names. And it carried men wherever orders demanded. In the ruins of Cologne, jeeps wound through streets choked with debris, their engines echoing against shattered cathedrals. In the Ruhr pocket, they ferried German prisoners by the thousands to collection points, each jeep towing trailers packed with captured weapons. At Dachau, one of the first Allied vehicles to enter the camp was a jeep with a red cross painted hastily on its hood. Its driver, Sergeant Peter Corsi, had to stop twice because the freed prisoners surrounded it, touching the machine as if it were a talisman. To the Germans, it had become something mythic. Soldiers called it Der kleine Teufel, the little devil. They spoke of its sound, that quick staccato rattle that announced the approach of the inevitable. Even in retreat, they sometimes tried to imitate it. Units captured American jeeps and painted them with black crosses, using them to sow confusion. But imitation could not erase the truth. The jeep belonged to the Americans the way the Panzer had once belonged to the Reich, an extension of national character. By April, as the Allies swept across the Elbe and the Soviet armies closed from the east, the jeep completed its conquest of Europe's geography. On roads cratered by bombs, it delivered surrender orders and peace proclamations. In forests, it became the courier of liberation. In the ruins of towns like Kassel and Magdeburg, jeeps drove through cheering crowds of civilians who had never seen an American soldier before, but recognized the machine instantly. At the same time, the statistics reached surreal proportions. Willys Overland and Ford had built more than 650,000 jeeps since 1941, more vehicles than Germany had built tanks. Shipping manifests showed that American industry had sent one jeep for every 14 soldiers overseas. They were built faster than the enemy could destroy them, at a rate of one every 80 seconds at peak production. Even as the war's final days descended into chaos, jeeps continued to appear in places no sane planner had expected. They crossed the Brenner Pass through snow to link with Allied forces from Italy. They forded the Danube to deliver ceasefire messages. They rolled into Berlin behind Soviet T-34 seconds, carrying journalists, translators, and military police. When the war ended in May, the soldiers who had driven them looked at the machines with affection that bordered on reverence. They had lived in them, fought in them, bled on their seats, and slept under their hoods. In photographs from those final weeks, you can see jeeps covered in chalk graffiti: "To Hell and Back," "Lucky Lady," "Berlin Express." Captured German officers, being driven to interrogation in those same vehicles, often sat silent, watching the countryside pass in a blur of mud and blossoms. One of them, a colonel from the 12th Panzer Division, muttered to his escort, "Your army rides in toys, but they have conquered the world." He was not wrong. The jeep had done what no other weapon of that war could claim. It had gone everywhere, done everything, and survived to see peace. In the end, it was not the biggest gun or the thickest armor that decided the war. It was the machine that could still move when everything else stopped. In the spring of 1945, on the shattered roads of Germany, the laughter that had begun 3 years earlier in a Tunisian desert was finally silent. The little open truck had crossed every kind of terrain and every doubt. The Germans had once laughed at the jeep. Now They saluted it. The war ended not with a roar, but with the rumble of tires. When the guns fell silent in May of 1945, the Jeep was still moving across Europe, across the Pacific, across the imagination of a world it had helped reshape. It had been born as a temporary tool, designed for a war that was supposed to end quickly. Yet by the time peace arrived, it had become immortal. The men who drove them carried the sound home in their bones, the metallic rattle of a gearbox in low range, the whine of the engine climbing a hill, the slap of canvas in the wind. It was the music of victory, and everywhere it went, it left behind a story. In the shattered towns of Germany and Italy, civilians watched in astonishment as jeeps rolled through rubble that had crushed every other vehicle. They carried doctors, engineers, priests, food, and leaflets printed with words like liberty and reconstruction. Children touched their fenders as they passed, as if touching the future. In France, they became parade cars for liberation. In Holland, they hauled bread to starving cities. In Norway, they delivered the first mail after 5 years of silence. In the Pacific, they performed miracles of distance. On Okinawa, jeeps climbed coral ridges under fire. On Luzon, they forded rivers that maps had marked as inaccessible. After the Japanese surrender, they rolled into Tokyo beside MacArthur's staff cars, their tires leaving tracks across the forecourts of the imperial palace. And in the months that followed, they carried home the symbols of peace instead of war: Red Cross nurses, supply officers, and photographers documenting the end of an age. The German officers who had once mocked them were among the first to ask for them after the surrender. The occupying armies had hundreds of thousands of jeeps left behind, and the Allies distributed them to rebuild what the war had erased. In the British zone, jeeps became mail carriers and ambulances. In France, they hauled lumber and bread. In Poland and Czechoslovakia, they became fire trucks and police cars. Even in defeated Germany, they served under new markings, driven by engineers clearing mines and rebuilding bridges. For the first time, the world saw an army's weapon turn into a peacetime machine. The Jeep, designed to conquer terrain, now conquered necessity. Factories that had once run day and night for war shifted to peace without stopping the line. Willys Overland in Toledo painted its first civilian Jeep a pale harvest yellow and christened it the CJ Civilian Jeep. Advertisements showed it not as a soldier's tool, but as a farmer's companion. The sun never sets on the new American workhorse. Farmers bought it to plow fields, ranchers to haul hay, explorers to cross mountains. In photographs of post-war America grain silos, logging camps, oil wells, you can find a Jeep in the background, dusty and half invisible, still doing its work. But in Europe, its legend was darker and deeper. German veterans who met again in the 1950s spoke of it with the same mixture of awe and resentment once reserved for the P-47 or the Sherman. They had measured victory in tons of steel. The Americans had measured it in motion. At the 1952 Bonn Conference on Post-War Reconstruction, General Franz Halder, former chief of the German General Staff, was asked how he explained the Wehrmacht's defeat in the West. He paused, then said simply, "They moved faster than our ideas." Later, in a private interview with an American historian, he elaborated, "You had machines that refused to stop. The Jeep was one of them. It was your philosophy in metal, simple, adaptable, and everywhere." The captured archives confirmed it. From North Africa to the Rhine, German reports repeated the same refrain: Feindfahrzeug unaufhaltbar, enemy vehicles unstoppable. Each note was written by men who had once dismissed that small, unarmored shape as a toy. The irony was complete by the time of the Cold War. The Bundeswehr, the new German army created in the 1950s, adopted the Jeep's direct descendant, the M38, as its standard light vehicle, American-made. The machine that had once humiliated them became their partner. Soldiers who had fought against it now drove it, saluting under NATO flags. Meanwhile, veterans' reunions in the United States treated the Jeep almost as a comrade. In one gathering of the Fifth Army in 1958, an old Willys model was towed onto the parade ground, engine sputtering. Men who had crossed Italy in them 20 years before ran their hands over its hood, tracing the faded white star. "She got us through, everything," one said quietly. "Mud, mines, and hell itself." Historians began to count what it had done. According to the Army Service Force's summary of 1946, jeeps had logged over 11 billion miles during the war. They had consumed over 3 billion gallons of fuel, carried millions of soldiers, and saved uncounted lives by keeping medical evacuation routes open. One statistic from the European Theatre Command concluded that the average jeep served more than 1,000 days in continuous operation, a lifespan unheard of for any wartime vehicle. Yet numbers alone could not explain its hold on memory. Because the jeep was never just a machine. It was a contradiction on wheels. Weak yet invincible, light yet enduring, unarmored yet immortal. It fought wars without killing, conquered without destroying. It stood for the idea that progress, not power, wins in the end. At the 1960 Pacific Veterans Reunion in Honolulu, a Japanese pilot who had fought in the Philippines approached an American counterpart. He bowed, then said in halting English, "Your small car, it never stopped. We could not understand how you did that." The American laughed and replied, "We didn't either. We just kept it running." The laughter was gentle now. Once, the world had laughed at the jeep as a toy. Then it had learned that simplicity could become supremacy. On display today in museums from Normandy to Tokyo, a single jeep tells the story more clearly than any tank or bomber can. Its paint is scratched, its seat torn, its tires cracked by time. But if you look close, you can see the shape of the century in its lines, a promise forged in mud and tested in fire. It crossed wadis in Tunisia, goat tracks in Sicily, rivers in France, snow in the Ardennes, ruins in Germany, and jungles in the Pacific. It carried soldiers to war and home again. And somewhere, in the silence that followed victory, its engine finally cooled. The laughter of those who once mocked it had long since faded, replaced by a quiet respect. Because when the dust settled and the tanks rusted where they stood, it was the jeep that kept moving.